information. At the end of this, my contact information will be available. You can also contact Ted Harris at the PPA for a copy of this presentation, as well as I'm going to offer a couple of other tools that will help you in your day-to-day to help keep you compliant. So this is who I am. I'm not going to go through this, but I just want to share my credentials. I have over 30 years of experience in the propane trucking as well as the petroleum industry. I've served on a couple of the national committees at PERC with CETP training. Also, I'm an instructor, a proctor, and a skill evaluator. One of the more important associations that I'm involved with is the Propane Gas Defense Association. It's the best hidden secret. We need to get more marketers to participate. It's attorneys, it's risk loss control, risk management. It really helps explain case studies and helps protect your organization. So, kind of an overview of the webinar this morning. I'm going to go through a lot of the training requirements and discuss how to be compliant, what needs to take place, and then also the importance of having policies and procedures that can tie into a lot of the requirements that will really help bring you compliant with OSHA, DOT, and a lot of the other various organizations that we have to comply with. So why is training important? It's not only required, as I already mentioned, by a lot of regulatory agencies, whether it's federal, whether it's state, whether it's local, but it's also critical to the success to your company and the safety for your staff, and as well as your customer and the communities you service. Sorry about that. So the training requirements does involve OSHA, and there's a lot of OSHA regulations out there that we really need to be familiar with. DOT, there's also requirements on the NFPA, and more importantly, NFPA 58, which specifically states under 4.4 that we have to have certain training under the scope of that code, and then you have to refresh it. And I'll talk a little more about that later. And then I already mentioned federal and state codes. So there is a required training, and the first one I'm going to talk about is under DOT, the HMR training, which we would normally refer to as hazmat training, or HM 126F. Certain people still refer to it. That was the interim rule, but that kind of resonates with a lot of folks in the industry. Then I'm going to go through some of the OSHA requirements. They may not all be applicable to your facility, but you really need to digest it and take a look at what is required under the general industry rules, OSHA 29 CFR 1910. Then I'm going to touch on a couple of the federal motor carrier safety administration rules that we have to follow. So I'm going to talk about those regulations as far as what needs to happen. And then NFPA 58 is the most important that ties in, and I'm going to talk about CETP training and how CETP training can be used as a vehicle to help you meet a lot of these requirements. So as far as the hazardous material, I mean, the Department of Transportation defines it as a material, as a substance that's capable of posing unreasonable risk to health, safety, and property when transported in commerce. So when we talk about that, it's for business purpose. And normally what we're going to be referring to is highway transportation, but there's other modes of transportation. So if you have rail, if you have pipeline, if you have air or water, you have to also be trained according to the rules on those as well. So DOT hazmat training is required. And if you have employees that perform any of these tasks under the hazardous material regulations, you're required to complete this DOT training. And that training is found under 49 CFR 172.400, and it lays out those requirements. So if you have any employees that do any of the following, whether they load it or unload it, test or recondition packaging, whether they're just preparing shipping papers or emergency response information, even the folks that purchase labels, markings, and placards have to be familiar with the rules. I've had some past experiences where I've had employees that would buy certain things and they were sold to them and they were incorrect when they were manufactured. So if you prepare the hazmat, responsible for the safety of it, operate the vehicle, even those that are the supervisors, whether you're the service coordinator, service manager, dispatch, delivery manager, general manager, any of those folks that supervise hazmat employees need to be trained. So what does the training entail? Well, naturally, general awareness familiarization training is just really going to teach them about the basics of the rules under the HMR. Function-specific training, though, is really geared towards, educating the employee on the specific practices regarding their duties. So if they're a propane delivery driver, they really need to understand all the functions to properly load the truck, properly operate it on the highway, and then properly make those deliveries. And then safety training really goes into depth. They need to understand the emergency response information. They need to understand measures to protect themselves. They also need, as part of function-specific and safety training, they really need to understand the safety features of their delivery vehicles and what to do in the event of an emergency. And then the fourth one is security awareness training. It really just, they need to be trained on the risk associated with transport and hazmat. There's over 800,000 shipments of hazardous materials on the highway in the United States every day. So we really need to do our part and enhance the security. So we need to teach them how to identify, potential security threats. And then the last one there, if you operate and you have to have a written security plan. And what the rules say on this, if you have a cargo tank motor vehicle that is 792 gallons or more, and you're delivering flammable gas, Class 2, Division 2.1 propane or liquefied petroleum gas, or Class 3 flammable liquids such as gasoline, not the combustibles, heating oil, kerosene, or diesel fuel. But if you're doing the flammables, you have to have an in-depth security plan. And as part of the training, then each of your employees have to be trained on the written parts that are applicable to them. So naturally, they need to understand your organizational security structure and the specific security procedures and their responsibilities under that plan. So when is training required? Well, any individual, any employee, whether they're temporary, part-time, or full-time, you have to have them trained within 90 days of employment. When we hire employees, we often train them day one, but the rules say specifically on these requirements, you have to have them trained within the first 90 days. And during that 90-day process, they cannot work unsupervised until they've had this critical training. If you have employees that are already working for you, that are not designated as hazmat employees, in my previous corporate job, we had service technicians that were not designated. They just operated service vans, but then they became propane tank setters. So they have to be afforded this same training with that transfer up to that new position within 90 days before they can operate and be on their own. And then there is a refresher requirement. This training has to happen every 3 years to keep them compliant with the DOT hazmat regulations. So what happens if you're out of compliance? Well, we all know if regulatory authority comes in, they like to levy fines. It could be a simple $1,000 fine per employee, but they have the right to levy fines during certain hazmat incidents or hazmat regulation violations of up to $100,000 per incident per day. So those can become very costly. So Ted, is there any questions so far?
There is not, hold on. There's not any questions at the moment. Again, I would like to, we had some people get on late here after 9 a.m. Just like to remind you that you are muted and you can ask questions via the question feature on GoToWebinar, and we will go through them for each one that's asked. We might have just got one in here right now. No, we didn't. But Eric, I would like to thank you for going through the DOT hazmat requirement and what is defined as a hazmat employee. We offer this training from the PPA standpoint. I'm sure it's something that you also offer, Eric, and we have a lot of companies that just think their drivers are the ones that need to go through this, and it's a much wider ranging definition for your employees. So thank you for covering that part of it.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, now we're going to move into one that's a little more complicated. When we talk about Occupational Safety and Health Administration, known as OSHA, which requires they have their hands into anything as part of your workplace, and your workplace can be your remote workplaces, can be your satellite plants, can be your primary locations. They require training for all applicable employees before exposure, and they mandate certain things to be done annually, as well as certain things to be refreshed. And then there's other trainings that you don't, once you do the initial training, unless something changes, or if they demonstrate their lack of ability to follow the proper rules and regulations, then you have to refresh them. So it gets very complicated. And this is where the training guideline that I put together that gives you compliance, who has regulation over it, the code reference, the training requirement, the refresher, and also provide some additional instructional notes that's where this guide will help you with a lot of these requirements. So as they do every year, OSHA examines their fine structures, and they typically in the middle of January, they introduce their new fines. So the maximum penalty today increases for this year, $13,260 for serious, other than serious, failure to correct. And this is each day the employer does not abate the condition. So those fines can grow every day. You could have a fine that they give you $10,000. It could be outstanding for 10 days. And next thing you know, you've been levied a $100,000 fine. There's also posting requirements. OSHA does have those. You post your on-the-job injury totals, the summaries, and there's other postings that are required within the workplace that they can fine you for. Now, if there's blatant disregard for some of the OSHA regulations, what they say is maximum as far as willful or repeated. So if you had something they already got you for and you don't correct it, or if something happens again and they come back in, they can fine you up to almost $133,000 per violation. And there you can look at how they adjust those penalties based on that Federal Civil Penalties Inflation Act. So these are the top 10 from 2018. As you notice, there's 5 construction, which is 1926, and there's 5 general industry, 1910. The one that's always at the top for general industry is usually the Hazard Communication Standard. That has to do with all the hazardous chemicals that are in your workplace and having a written program and training for those. There's other, lockout, tagout is another important one. As an industry in the propane and oil, we don't really use respirators, but there is those. And then naturally, your powered industrial trucks. And even with us with fall protection, it falls into the 1910, but it's more prominent for fines under the construction standard. So there's a lot of trainings, and this is just a list of the majority or the primary ones for our industry. And I'm going to talk about several of these in more depth. The HazCom standard, personal protective equipment, portable fire extinguisher, hand and power tool, confined space, emergency action plan, and lockout tagout. And then we have the truck mounted cranes, lifts, forklifts. You have to really review all of these various requirements to see what is applicable to your organization, and then identify who is affected by these OSHA requirements, and then put together a training program that can take care of the training needs and then having the proper documentation. So the Hazard Communication Standard does specifically state you have to have a written plan that is there and available that describes how your company is going to meet the OSHA requirement for the Hazard Communication Program. And then as part of that program, we have to have a chemical inventory. Everything has a physical or health hazard or both. You have to have it listed out on an inventory, whether it's in your facility, whether it's at an off-site satellite, whether it's in your company vehicles. You have to have that listed, and you need to do a periodic review of those. And that way you can keep current. At least annually, you should do a review. And then, you have labeling requirements under the global harmonization. And then as part of that chemical inventory, once you've gotten that listed, you're going to make a determination of whether you have the safety data sheets, because that's all used part of the training for your employees that are going to be handling those products. So you're required to provide effective information and training, chemicals in the work area. So it must be done at the initial time of assignment and when any new chemicals are introduced. So once you've done this training, a reoccurring training is not mandated under OSHA. The only time it's mandated is if your program changes or you bring in new chemicals that you hadn't previously worked with. Some companies do refreshers. OSHA recommends a refresher just to keep people in tune, but it's not mandated. In addition, the training also has to include details under your program on explaining labels. We have the new labeling under the global harmonization, so you should have already completed that several years ago when it was mandated under the OSHA standard. And then how to relabel smaller containers as they're coming into your facilities, and ensuring, because that's one of the bigger fines that OSHA walks in, they find unlabeled containers. They usually write fines for each one that is not labeled. They don't write one fine for all of them. They usually give you individual fines. And then also they want to make sure you have the safety data sheets, and the employees need to be trained on on the new global harmonization safety data sheet, which contains 16 sections, and they need to understand as part of that training the information that's contained on any of the chemicals or products they're going to be working with. So any questions about the OSHA HAZCOM standard?
Nothing has come in yet.
Okay. So the next part of this is personal protective equipment. I work and I do a lot of driver evaluations. I do a lot of skill evaluations for the CETP program. I do a lot of risk management reviews and get on trucks with drivers. And this is one of the bigger things I see our industry taking for granted, not wearing proper personal protective equipment. I'll usually carry some stuff with me and issue it at time of me jumping on the truck because God forbid someone get injured while I'm with them. But we really need to train your employees. So as a company in the petroleum industry, you have to do a job safety analysis, all the tasks that are performed. More importantly, those tasks that are required with setting tanks, delivering propane, evacuating propane, all those various activities. And you need to do a job of safety analysis saying what are the issues, what could potentially go wrong, how can we protect the employee? Can we engineer it out, or do we need to wear certain protection? So you have to do that assessment first, and you have to keep a copy of that. If OSHA walks in and you don't have that assessment, you would be in violation of the actual OSHA standard for PPE. So then you need to select and understand by job description, what are they going to be, what are they required as a minimum from head to toe to wear. And then OSHA is silent on who has to purchase it. It doesn't mandate that the employer has to purchase the equipment. It leaves that open to however you're going to operate your business. I would recommend in most cases that the employer purchase it. That way you can ensure that the employee will have what they need and that they'll wear it. Then you have to communicate this, and you have to actually train them. A lot of what we wear in our industry is pretty simplistic. It's not really a lot of rigorous training required for it, but they need to understand when PPE is necessary. So they need to have a clear understanding. And the easiest way to meet this standard under OSHA is to have a written policy on your personal protective equipment, then meet with your employees, have them sign off on that policy and procedure, and that will fulfill the needs under OSHA. What PPE is necessary, how to properly wear it, the limitations, the care and maintenance, the useful life, and then each effective employee shall demonstrate an understanding of the training they received and the ability to use the personal protective equipment as it's designed. So when is retraining required? If you have reason to believe that any effective employee has already been trained that does not have an understanding and a skill required, you're required to make sure that employee gets retrained. So it could be changes in workplace. They may go from one position to another. So they may be a service technician, now a driver, and that may affect their choice on what PPE is going to be worn. Certain PPE may be rendered obsolete. It could be changes in the use of or your company policy. But if an employee demonstrates their inability to understand or properly wear it, you have to retrain them. More importantly, if you have an on-the-job injury and it's reported and it's discovered that proper PPE and you have a policy in place, it wasn't worn under that program. It's bad enough when an employee gets injured, but if you don't discipline your employee, OSHA is going to say you do not have a policy and a procedure in place. So it's very important that if people are injured, that you discipline them. It could just be a simple verbal written warning. It could be a suspension. It could be termination, depending on the severity. Here's an employee that's working with some parts cleaner, no safety glasses, no gloves, no anything. These are the things we want to try to avoid. So any questions about PPE?
Nothing at this time.
All right. Okay, portable fire extinguisher training under the OSHA standard, which is found at 29 CFR 1910.157. Where employees are permitted, or more importantly, are expected to use a fire extinguisher as part of their job, then they have to be trained. So when we say that, we're really referring to those, and they're normally going to be our folks out there operating equipment. So if they have small truck fires, incipient stage fires, whether it's on a delivery vehicle, whether it's on a service van installation vehicle, they're going to be expected, so they have to be trained. Now, you could have employees in your office that could grab an extinguisher to use it to try to make an exit out of the building if it caught fire. Those do not have to be trained, but I always encourage, why not include certain folks like that as well? So as part of the training, you have to familiarize employees with the general use of a fire extinguisher, the hazards involved with incipient stage firefighting, and then training on the use of a firefighting equipment. So it's more than just classroom training. So you have to receive initial training, and then you have to have an annual refresher as part of that training. So the employee, as part of the training, needs to demonstrate their ability to put out a small incipient stage fire, as illustrated there in the picture. Or some companies print in a simulator, and that's perfectly fine under the OSHA standard, using a simulator to also demonstrate your skill set to put out an incipient stage fire. So any questions on portable fire extinguishers?
Nothing at this time.
Okay, as far as hand and power tools, we often forget about that. So there are some general requirements, and in 29 CFR found in 1910.241 through 244, and training is required before use. So the employee has to be trained on proper use. A lot of the hand tools we use, that's pretty self-explanatory, but some of the power equipment that we use, they need to be trained before use. They recommend an annual refresher, but unless a tool or something changes, once they've been trained on it, unless they demonstrate their inability to use it properly, then there is no mandated refresher. So we want to make sure, as far as the training objective, we want to provide safe practices when working with hand and power tools. And we want to make sure they're using the proper tools for the job. We want to make sure these tools are being maintained regularly. We want to make sure we're using the right tool. We want to inspect each and every time before use. We always want to operate according to manufacturer's instructions. And we also want to ensure that our employees are wearing the proper personal protective equipment whenever operating or using any hand or power tools. So, any questions about hand or power tools?
Nothing came in.
Okay. Confined space. Confined space is an issue. We don't often run into it too often in our industry, depending on where you're situated in the United States, but it is an issue in our industry, and it's really understanding what confined space definition is. And I'm going to just explain what that is. I've also put together a simple flow chart for a propane crawl space. I used to reside in Maryland, and I did a lot of work back in the late 80s, early 90s, and I was in a lot of crawl spaces. So I put various flow charts together for the oil side of the business and the propane side, as well as the HVAC going in attics and that kind of stuff. So if anybody would like those flow charts, we'd be happy to send them to you, because it helps further explain, and you can communicate to your employees to figure out if they are entering confined space, and if, more importantly, they're entering into a confined space that requires a permit to be going in there, unless you declassify it. So here's what OSHA says in regards to a confined space. A space that has all of the following characteristics is defined as a confined space. So it's large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform an assigned work, and has limited or restricted means for entry or exit. So it's not easy to walk in and walk out. It's limited ability. So it may take extra time for an employee to get out of that space if something were to go wrong. And it's normally not designed for continuous human occupancy. So if you give some thought to those could be old cellars, they could be crawl spaces, those could be attics. The traditional ones we're familiar with are cargo tanks, large storage tanks. Usually we're hiring contractors to do those entries when we need any work done on that kind of stuff. When is a permit required for a confined space? It has any one or more of the following characteristics: contains or has potential to contain a hazardous environment. That's where we don't want to be entering into a space that has a hazardous environment that could be a detriment to our employee going into that space. Contains a material that has potential for engulfing an entry, or as an internal configuration such as an entry could be trapped or asphyxiated inwardly, convergent walls, or by a floor which slopes downward or tapers. I will tell you, in the late, I think it was 1989, I was in a crawl space trying to run a gas line for a customer that had converted electric stove to a gas. And back then I was a lot thinner, and I had to get up into this space, and as I got in there, I got trapped. And it took me over 20 minutes to actually get myself out. Had I known these rules, I probably would have never attempted to do that test. So, and then contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. So when it's a permit required, there's certain obligations that have to be done either to declass it, or there's other requirements before entering the space. So here's a simple flow chart that I put together for a propane crawl space, remembering my experience back in 1989. So is there end-use equipment or lines with fittings or valves in the crawl space? If you answer no, is there any indication of a product release, odor, inventory, other? No. Are there any other recognized hazards in that space? Snakes, I've run across that in crawl spaces. Open sewer that could put you at risk for health effects. If you answer no to that, and if it's no to all three hazard classes, space may be entered without an entry permit or atmospheric testing requirement. If you answer yes to any of those, then you're going to go through the rest of the flow chart and make a determination. Can you enter that space? How do you enter that space? Do I need to do atmospheric monitoring for the various things that are in that space or could potentially be in that space? Or there may come a point where you're just not allowed to enter that space. So any questions on confined space? It's very challenging for the industry.
I did get a request to get a copy of the flow chart that you reviewed, which I can connect you after the fact.
Absolutely, and I have several others that I put together for companies that go into attics, you know, with the heat that could affect them, and I also have one with the oil for the petroleum side that we've put together to help better explain it. I think it's great to have an educational piece so we can at least start to identify if we're going into these spaces before an accident actually happens, and then have an OSHA tell us it was a confined space. All right, emergency action plan. So an employer must have an emergency action plan whenever an OSHA standard requires it. So you may say, when is it required? Well, the simple explanation would be if you have fire extinguishers at your facilities, whether they're inside or outside, and you expect people to evacuate upon an emergency, you have to have an emergency action plan. So you can do it one of two ways. So an emergency action plan has to be in writing if you have more than 10 employees at your facility. So you have to have it in writing, you have to communicate, and you have to train your employees on the emergency action plan. Before exposure, they recommend an annual refresher because they don't mandate it, but they recommend you do a drill so you can make sure everybody's in tune to what their expectation and how to handle an emergency. And that the emergency action plan training is found at 29 CFR 1910.38. So if you have 10 or fewer employees, you may communicate that plan orally to your employees. The important part is to make sure your employees know what the expectation is under the plan, what their responsibilities are. And then in most cases, if you have your offices that are not simple offices where you can see the exit, have an exit and having diagrams of where your fire extinguishers are located, where the exit routes are, and then making sure they know where their meeting place is should you have a serious event at your facility. So the minimum elements is on the plan: procedures for reporting a fire or other emergency, procedures for emergency evacuation, including the type of evacuation and the exit route assignments, procedures to be followed by employees who remain to operate critical plant operations before they evacuate, procedures for, and this is really important, account for your employees, but not even your employees. If you have larger facilities or you have larger buildings, office spaces, it's a good thing not only under the security requirements to have people sign in so you know who's on site, but it's even more important if you had an emergency to be able to account for those non-employees that could be at your facility as well. And then procedures to be followed by employees performing rescue or medical duties. And then the name, the job title of every employee who may be contacted by employees who need information. So who's responsible for the plan? Who's going to update the plan? Who's going to provide the training under the plan? So you must review the emergency action plan with each employee covered by the plan. So when you initially develop your plan, you need to cover it. And when they're initially assigned certain job responsibilities, so they know their responsibilities under the plan. And anytime you update your plan, so at a minimum, you should do a review of your plan annually to make sure it's still in tune to your operation. Or if there's other things that have changed, then you need to update the plan and then do a refresher with the employees affected under the plan. So any questions on emergency action plan?
Nothing came in.
Okay. So lockout, tagout. It goes beyond more than just big pipeline operations. It goes more than just mechanical operations. It could be an HVAC technician that could be at a house replacing a furnace and fails to lock out the electrical panel or at least a breaker, and it could result in an injury. So the lockout, tagout, and electrical safety training is found at 29 CFR 1910-147. Naturally, anybody that's going to be covered under lockout, tagout, they need to be trained before exposure, and it's required if new procedures are introduced, job requirements change, and so forth. So only authorized employees who have been trained may perform lockout, tagout. To ensure isolation of equipment before personnel commence work on equipment powered by either electrical, hydraulic fluids, gases, and mechanical energy. So we're really wanting to make sure zero energy state, so no one gets injured as part of repairing and replacing the equipment. So avoid 4 types of energy source related accidents. Could be as part of accidental startup while you're going to perform work, could be electrical shock, could be a release of hazardous materials. So it could be where you have defective valves at your facility, such as a propane facility, and something goes wrong. And it could be a release of stored energy as well. So according to OSHA, about 10% of all accidents in the workplace are caused by not following procedures for lockout, tagout. So this equates really to 250,000 incidents per year, resulting in 50,000 injuries and over 100 fatalities on an annual basis. So employees should be retrained under certain conditions if they have a change in job assignment, change in equipment, machinery, or processes that present a new hazard, change in energy control procedure, if deviations from procedures are revealed, if they had an accident or incident involving lockout, tagout, you're going to want to retrain them. Here again with confined space, here again with PPE, here again with lockout, tagout, you can have a policy and procedure in place that can provide your guidance on training your employees, assigning your kits to your employees, and then having a sign-off to help meet the regulations. So any questions about lockout, tagout?
Nothing at this time.
Okay, truck-mounted crane. As you can see there, I meant the big crane, but there's been a lot of discussion and there's been a lot of debate over this, and MPGA has done a great job trying to work through this issue, but it still resulted in, under the construction standard, needing, a more rigorous certification. But even before all that took place, under general industry, 29 CFR 1910, if you're operating truck-mounted crane, you still are required to have formal training. And that formal training is needed for any employee that's going to operate a crane or a boom. So the training includes more than just classroom. It has to be specific to the type of crane they're going to operate. So the manufacturer's instructions need to be reviewed. Then there has to be skill-based training, even under 1910, where you look at the crane, they understand how to inspect the crane, they understand how to properly operate the crane, including the load charts for the cranes themselves. That training has to be documented. You must do a refresher training every 3 years, or if retraining could be required if you have an accident or a near miss. You see an employee operating it unsafe, so an action that is unsafe. And then also, anytime equipment is changed, if you don't have the same type of crane, or you have locations that have different styles, each employee has to be trained specifically on the proper use and care of each crane they're going to operate. You have to have that document. Under 1926, and I got to give credit to all the propane gas associations, and I'm not sure what the Pennsylvania Petroleum Association did, but on the propane side, they did a great job communicating from the National Propane Gas Association these changes that were coming. So it was effective November 10th. OSHA said, new standard for crane and construction requiring employer to provide each operator with sufficient training. So it's a combination of formal and practical, which is the skill and the knowledge and the judgment necessary to operate. So this is going to go well above what 1910 required. So if you're going to operate cranes at construction site, you have to be certified. And that certification has to be done by, may be done by type alone. It must be issued by an accredited certifying body. And I give one example here, the National Commission for Certification of Crane Operators, the NCCCO. As of February 7th of this past year, as an employer, you were required to evaluate your crane operators according to the specified criteria and really take a look at, do they need this certification? And if so, you have to send them to one of those accredited schools. So as an industry, we put together a flow chart to help you understand when you would require that certification. So is your company delivering tanks at a construction site? If you say no, you never have to worry about it. And a construction site could be a new house being built. It doesn't have to be a commercial industrial site. It can be just a new residential house being built. If you say yes to that, are you replacing tanks of the same size on site? You say yes, certification is not required. If you say no, you're not replacing and you're installing. Is your company installing and hooking up a tank immediately following delivery? If you say no, you don't need the certification. If you say yes, you're required to have the certification. So just to break that down into simple terms, you show up to a construction site, you have a tank on the back of the truck, you set the tank off at the job site, and you leave that job site. And you come back, whether it's an hour later or later in the day, to hook it up, you do not need the certification. Or let's say you set the tank and then you have another crew that's going to come in later because you have a crane truck that you're just going to set tanks, and you have a crew coming in later and they're going to hook it up. You do not need that certification. But if you're going to set the tank in place and you're going to perform activities to install that container at the time of delivery, you need the certification. And certification is third party. You got to be knowledge tested, skill evaluated, and on average, per employee, on average, that's going to cost at least $5,000 plus whatever travel expenses that are required to get your employees to these facilities. So any questions about cranes?
Nothing at this time. Actually, hold on.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Hold on, Eric. Was told setting a tank at an existing home that we are doing a furnace replacement at the same place meets the requirement of a construction site. Your opinion?
It does not. It has to do with the structural building being built. Replacement equipment or even installation of equipment does not fall under 1926, the construction standard. That would still be general industry 1910.
Thank you.
Okay, as far as industrial lift trucks or forklifts, as we commonly call them, not everybody has these. And as I said earlier, this is where you can when you look through the list, you got to see what's applicable. And even for the crane, you should have a policy and procedure on that designates how you're going to train, having that training done, having that documented. Same for forklifts. So, safe operation. So you got to have the employees ensure that each powered industrial truck operator is competent to operate each specific equipment that you make. You may only have one forklift, or you have multiple styles that they would need to be trained. So you'd have to train them and then evaluate them. So prior to allowing an employee to operate a powered industrial truck, except for training purposes, the employer shall ensure the operators have successfully completed the training that is required under the OSHA standard, which for forklift training is under 29 CFR 1910.178. You have to receive this training prior to use, and then you have to be refreshed every 3 years at a minimum, but there's other times when you might have to refresh sooner, and I'll cover that in a minute. So trainees can operate under the direct supervision of persons who have been trained, so they're carded to operate it. So they have the knowledge, demonstrated knowledge, they've successfully completed the training, so they can help train any new employee that you need to get through the training process. And then where such operations does not endanger the trainee or other employees. And the training needs to consist of a combination of formal instruction, so that would typically be some type of lecture or discussion or an interactive computer learning. Could be some videotapes and some written materials included. But then they also have to do the practical. And the practical means they need to be able to demonstrate. So as a trainer, you got to demonstrate proper inspection, proper care and use of a forklift. And then that trainee has to learn that process. And then they got to become proficient in that process. And once they become proficient in that process, then they can be signed off on and carded so they can operate the forklift. You really don't want to have anybody that's not carded operating a forklift. If something goes wrong and OSHA comes in, they're going to levy tens of thousands of dollars worth of fines. So once all operator training and evaluation shall be conducted, persons who have the knowledge. So some companies will bring in a forklift company, while others may bring in a safety consultant like P3 Propane Safety, or you may have folks on staff that have the qualifications to do that training for your employees. OSHA just says they have to just have the demonstrated knowledge, training, and experience to train others on those forklifts. Refresher training is required, so you have to do it at least every 3 years. But if you have an operator that is observed to operate the vehicle in an unsafe manner, you should pull their card immediately, and retraining is required. If they're involved in an accident or a near miss, if they had an evaluation that reveals the operator's not operating the truck safely, so you may do periodic reviews of your operators. If they're assigned to operate a different type of truck or a piece of equipment, then they need to be actually trained on a new piece of equipment, or a condition in the workplace changes in a manner that could affect the safe operation. They need to be trained. And then an evaluation of each power industrial truck operator's performance naturally has to be refreshed at least every 3 years. So any questions about forklifts?
Not at this time.
Okay, very good. As far as the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, there is some training required initially for all applicable employees. So, and generally speaking, this is going to be your hazmat employees. So they have to be familiar with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, parts 390 to 397. And I usually cover a lot of that as part of my hazmat training. But, you know, those parts, and a lot of folks will be issued the actual green pocketbook to help them have a reference. But more importantly, some of those sections that really need to be covered and need to have a good understanding, for instance, would be hours of service, part 395. Very important for them to understand that. Part 396, inspection, repair, and maintenance. Part 397, transportation of hazardous material, driving and parking rules, among just to name a few. So it's very important they get familiar with that. As far as the entry-level driver training, you know, right now, on or before February 7th of 2020, if they're going to operate commercially and they're going to be interstate, meaning they're going to go across state line, it's a pretty simple entry-level driver training program. So as far as those training requirements, they have to be trained if they're going to get a new CDL. So if you have drivers that don't, or technicians or whoever that are coming in that do not currently have a CDL, they have to be trained as an entry-level driver. That training has to be given and documenting, and that covers hours of service for drivers, driver wellness, whistleblower protection as appropriate to the entry-level driver's current position, in addition to passing their CDL. After February 27, 2020, the only way to get this training under the federal rules would be to go to a federally registered training facility. So in basic terms, a truck driving school to actually get a new CDL if they've never had one. So for interstate commerce, it's going to make it a little more difficult. We already have a driver shortage, but it's going to make it a little more difficult to get folks through CDL training and get them new CDLs. And as far as substance abuse and alcohol testing awareness, for any employee that's going to be part of that program, whether you have non-safety sensitive in your drug and alcohol testing, or if you're only doing the safety sensitive under the federal rules, then you should have a policy and procedure on that. You should training for that, even though it's contained in 40 CFR. You should train your employees, have them sign off on that policy so they understand the consequences of testing positive or fail to provide a test, fail to show up for a test. And then as managers or supervisors at your facility, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration requires 60-minute training on substance abuse and how to identify that as far as reasonable suspicion, and then alcohol as well. And you have to have a documented 60-minute training for each of these as a manager. If you're going to take an employee that you directly witness that exhibits the potential of being under the influence of drugs or alcohol, to go take them for a test. Failure to be trained, and if you grab an employee to do that, could be a lot of consequences for you and your company. So any questions on the basics of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration?
Not at this time.
Okay, very good. All right, so CETP training. Many of us are familiar with the Certified Employee Training Program. It's one of the industry's most recognized training programs. It's a great vehicle for meeting a lot of the training requirements that are necessary under NFPA 58. It's a great way of really getting the skills to help meet a lot of the DOT function-specific safety, and also, more importantly, a lot of the OSHA rules and regulations, designed to ensure that each employee in the propane industry has the necessary knowledge and skills to perform their work safely and effectively. The program's been around for a long time. There are 14 different certification areas covering a variety of skills through NPGA CETP certification program. There is some transition and some changes coming. The CETP training is housed under PERC, the Propane Education Research Council. Currently, NPGA has the certification process, and they have a learning management system that tracks it all for NPGA through Industrial Training Services in Murray, Kentucky. I've been told there's going to be some changes early next year where that learning management system is now going to be housed with PERC. So all the CETP training, along with some other training, will be housed through that learning management system if you register through that at PERC. And then there may be some changes with the certification process as well. As I already mentioned, this program does help employers and employees comply with NFPA 58, Section 4.4, which requires personnel who transfer or transport propane, whose primary duties fall within the scope of the code, have documented initial training, and then you have to have refresher training every 3 years. This is just an evolution map. CETP has come a long way since 1987. There's a lot of modules to be certified in, and I'll have a slide that I'll show about training that we're going to be doing for the PPA this summer in Allentown, and I'll further discuss that. But basic practices and principles, and then bobtail propane delivery 2.2 is very important for any driver of a propane delivery vehicle. And if you have employees that are setting tanks, they should be basic. They should also have CETP 4.1, designing and installing exterior vapor distribution system that involves getting a tank to the house, running the lines outside. And then 4.2 is really making that final connection and placing those systems into service after you've done your safety survey and validated those systems, and then doing all the required various tests. And there's several others that are there for certification. So the way the certification works, they have to be trained, they have to pass the certification exam, and that has to be submitted currently to Industrial Training Services. And then within 12 months of passing the exam, a skill evaluation has to be performed. That's an assessment of that employee's ability to perform all the required functions under that certification process as far as that training module. And it has to be sent in within 12 months. If not, it's invalid. It won't go through. So what does that mean? Well, the purpose of the skill assessment is really combined into two important aspects. Provide structured on-the-job training for any of your LP gas employees under the direction of an experienced and qualified skill evaluator. Doesn't necessarily have to be the skill evaluator. It could be an experienced employee, and then you may bring a third-party skill evaluator, such as like P3 propane safety or any of the other ones that are out there, where they come in and do the final evaluation. Standardized conditions under which the employee demonstrates his or her performance of the task. And then the skill assessment is designed to document the employee's on-the-job training experience and the ability to be able to perform those job-related tasks. I'm not going to read this whole slide due to the timing, but a skill evaluation has to be someone really with a demonstrated understanding and knowledge of all those aspects that are required. And they also have to be in a registered skill evaluator through NPGA, which is through some simple training through the industrial training services, because the skill evaluator has to be registered, sign off on an affidavit that gets sent in through to NPGA to certify the employee. There is a remain current now because of the NFPA 58 requirements. We have two avenues. You can complete a PERC produce refresher training for each certification area obtained. So it's on a 3-year cycle. So if you want to remain current, you want to keep in compliant with NFPA 58 for those certain aspects, you have to at least conduct this refresher training for each of those certifications, and it needs to be documented. And then refresher training could be in a classroom setting with an NPGA registered proctor like myself or a skill evaluator, or for some of the certification can be completed online. There's no requirement for formal testing or skills evaluation. Simply completing the training and document it will cover you. But if you want to remain current and active under NPGA certification, then you have to go through testing to be able to do that. And currently that would include having industrial training services in Murray, Kentucky involved. So we're here at the end of the program. I did mention I wanted to just cover, Ted has put together with P3 Propane Safety some CETP training programs later on this summer. The first being the CETP Basic, which every employee should come through, whether it's a CSR, whether it's a driver, whether it's a technician, regardless of position. If they're touching your propane operation, they should at least have CETP Basic. That's going to be offered July 15th and 16th. That same week, they're also going to do the bobtail certification on the 17th and 18th. So any of your employees that are going to operate your cargo tank motor vehicle to deliver propane should come through this certification. And then for those employees that are going to take tanks or cylinders to your customer locations to set them, install them, run gas lines outside, that's CETP 4-1, August 6th and 8th through 8th. And then the last course that's going to be offered, and this could be applicable to even not just your CDL, but any of your technicians that are going to go out and perform a gas check, a propane system inspection, anybody that's going to make the final connection, validate the system, do all the required testing, and place it into service. 4-2 is a great program for that, and that's going to be offered in Allentown on August 13th through the 15th. So with that, I would open it up to any questions.
We have not had any additional ones come in. I would like to add, Eric, thank you. Very well done. In regards to the classes that we are hosting in Allentown this summer, they do include the basic principle. Well, they include the associated book as well as the exam into the cost. And if you are a PPA member, there's a discount for attending the class. So I hope it's something that you can take advantage of. We'll give it a couple more seconds here for any other questions. You do have Eric's information on the screen if you would like to get in touch with him or have any additional follow-up questions. And Eric, I will connect you with the person that requested a copy of the flow chart. But other than that, thank you very much for doing this today, and I hope everyone found it beneficial.
Yeah, and if anybody would like a copy of the presentation as a future reference, that's fine. And if anybody, just let Ted or myself know if you want a copy of the training guideline that gives you the regulatory requirement, the code reference, and how often you need to do the training. Be happy to send that to you as well, in addition to those flow charts for the confined space. And I want to thank you, Ted, and I want to thank the PPA for allowing me to present here for your membership today.
Thank you, Eric. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.